There comes a point where what exhausts you is no longer only the difficulty of life, but the way life keeps trying to get inside you. A setback is not just a setback, it becomes a mood that follows you all day. Someone's disrespect is not just a moment, it lives in your mind long after they have moved on. Pressure, disappointment, unfairness, delay, pettiness, rejection. None of it simply happens outside you. It enters, it lingers, it changes your state, and after enough of that, you do not just want relief, you want a different kind of strength. You want to become harder to pull down. Not colder, not numb, not indifferent in the empty sense, but less available to every irritation, every setback, every opinion, every careless act, every piece of life that seems determined to steal your peace and then leave you to rebuild it alone. Because one of the quietest forms of suffering is living as if the world has too much access to your inner condition. To be unbothered in the deepest sense is not to stop caring. It is to stop giving everything the right to disturb your center. It is to keep your dignity when life becomes petty, to keep your direction when life becomes heavy, to remain inwardly governed when the outside world is trying to recruit you into frustration, bitterness, insecurity, or collapse. That is not denial. It is a serious form of freedom. There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from catastrophe. It comes from accumulation. A comment that lingers too long. A delay that shifts your mood more than it should. A tense interaction that stays in your body long after it ends. A small disappointment that seems to drain more energy than the event itself deserves. Nothing dramatic has happened, and yet something inside you feels altered, heavier, less steady than before. This is one of the quietest ways life pulls a person down. Not always through major loss or obvious hardship, but through ordinary friction. Through the low-grade irritations, little humiliations, inconvenient delays, off moods, careless words, changed tones, missed expectations, and small moments of disrespect that should have passed through you more lightly than they did. Instead, they get in, they linger, they shape your inner state, and by the end of the day, you are not only tired from living, you are tired from how much of life was allowed to enter you. That pattern is easy to underestimate because each individual moment seems too minor to justify the effect it has. So you tell yourself you should be over it. You should be stronger than this. You should not let something so small throw you off. But the real problem is often not that one small thing affected you. It is that too many small things keep taking more from you than they should. A little peace here, a little confidence there, a little clarity, a little emotional stability. And over time, those losses add up. This is why some people feel privately worn down, even when life, on paper, does not look disastrous. Their inner world has become too accessible to ordinary disturbance. The friction of daily life is no longer staying outside where it belongs. It is setting the tone inside. A delay becomes discouragement. Someone's mood becomes your heaviness. A small social slight becomes hours of mental replay. An inconvenience becomes an emotional residue you continue carrying into moments that had nothing to do with the original event. That is the pain point hidden inside this title. Not only that life is hard, but that life keeps getting too much access to your state, too much permission to disturb your peace, redirect your mood, cloud your thinking, and slowly lower the quality of your day. What drains you is not only the weight of major problems, It is the repeated loss of inner stability to things that should not have so much power over you. And when that pattern goes unexamined, you do not just feel bothered. You begin to feel internally easy to pull down. One of the hardest truths to accept is that life does not pull you down only through what it does to you. It also pulls you down through what you allow it to become inside you. Two people can experience the same inconvenience, the same criticism, the same delay, the same careless tone, and walk away with very different inner consequences. The event may be identical. The entry is not. That difference matters more than most people realize. Because being bothered is rarely about impact alone. It is about access. Something happens outside you, but then something else happens inside you. The mind begins replaying it. The body keeps holding it. The feeling expands beyond the moment that caused it. A passing irritation becomes a state. A disappointment becomes a lens. A small wound becomes a private atmosphere that colors everything that follows. And once that happens, the problem is no longer only that life was difficult for a moment. The problem is that the moment was admitted as authority. That is how small things become heavy. Not because they are always objectively large, but because they are psychologically given too much space, too much meaning, too much right to govern what happens next in your inner world. A rude comment is over, but it is still inside you. A plan changed, and now your whole emotional posture has changed with it. Someone else's energy enters the room, and somehow enters your nervous system too. What happened externally may have been brief. What happened internally becomes prolonged. This is where many people misdiagnose their own suffering. They think the problem is simply that life is hard, people are difficult, things go wrong, and the world keeps producing new reasons to feel unsettled. But that explanation is incomplete. Life is hard, yes. People are difficult, yes. But what keeps pulling you down is often that your inner world remains too open, too porous, too permissive with disturbance. The gate is weak. The filter is undertrained. Too much gets admitted before it has earned the right to shape your state. That is not a moral failure. It is a structural problem. It means your inner boundaries are not yet strong enough to decide what gets to pass through you and what should stop at the edge. It means irritation becomes entry too easily. Disrespect becomes identity too quickly. Delay becomes discouraged too automatically. Inconvenience becomes emotional weather instead of remaining what it actually was, one moment in a much larger day. Think of how often the body reacts before the wiser self has spoken. A text feels cold. A meeting feels tense. A plan falls apart. The first reaction is immediate, but then, instead of being noticed and guided, that reaction is allowed to spread. It becomes your tone, your attention, your interpretation, your energy. That is what gives life its downward pull, not only the event, but the admission. So the first real shift is this. Stop asking only, "What happened to me?" Start asking, "What did I let this become inside me?" That question is sharper, more useful, more honest. Because life will keep happening. But if every event keeps getting full emotional access to your mind, body, and identity, then ordinary friction will continue producing extraordinary inner cost. What makes this pattern more serious than it first appears is that it does not stay contained inside isolated moments. Being easily bothered is never only about one bad day, one rude comment, one delay, one disappointment, one shift in tone. Every time life is allowed to set your state too easily, something is being practiced, something is being reinforced, and over time, what is reinforced begins to feel natural, then normal, then inevitable. That is how weakness gets trained quietly. Not always through major collapse, but through repeated inner permission. Permission for inconvenience to become discouraged. Permission for someone else's mood to become your burden. Permission for disrespect to become a mental occupation. Permission for small setbacks to take your focus, drain your energy, and alter the way you carry yourself for hours afterward. Each one may seem minor on its own, but repeated enough, they stop being moments and start becoming habits of mind. This is why being easily disturbed is more dangerous than it looks. It is not only tiring, it is formative. The mind learns from repetition. If irritation is repeatedly allowed to govern your mood, the mind becomes quicker to surrender. If disappointment is repeatedly allowed to become heaviness, the mind becomes more fluent in heaviness. If every slight delay or inconvenience is admitted as authority, then authority keeps getting handed outward. And the more often that happens, the more fragile your inner life becomes. Not because you were born weak, but because weakness has been rehearsed. Think about what that means in practical terms. A person speaks carelessly, and your mind stays with it for half the day. A plan changes, and you lose your sense of direction. Someone doubts you, and now their opinion begins shaping your emotional posture. A difficult morning quietly decides the tone of the entire afternoon. In each case, the outer event did more than happen. It was allowed to dictate your condition, and when that becomes a repeated pattern, you are no longer simply reacting. You are training dependency on external conditions for internal stability. That dependency has a cost. It means peace becomes conditional. Confidence becomes conditional. Direction becomes conditional. Your ability to remain yourself becomes dependent on whether life is currently behaving in a way that feels fair, smooth, validating, or easy. And if that is the arrangement, then life will always have too much leverage over you, because life is not built to protect your state for you. Other people will be careless, plans will change, delays will happen, petty behavior will exist, pressure will arrive. If every one of those things can reliably lower the quality of your mind, then your inner life is living without enough structure to protect itself. This is where self-betrayal enters. Not dramatic betrayal, but quiet daily betrayal. You keep handing over parts of your state to things that did not earn the right to hold them. You let nonsense borrow your peace. You let inconvenience steal your clarity. You let temporary friction decide the emotional quality of moments that could have remained your own. And over time, that shapes identity. You begin to experience yourself as someone whose life can move too easily, someone whose center is too available to interrupt, someone who must first hope the world behaves well before they can behave steadily. That is why this matters. Not because being bothered is embarrassing, but because repeated disturbance quietly trains fragility in the exact places where you most need strength. So the real question is no longer only what bothered you today. It is what kind of person that disturbance is training you to become. Many people hear the word unbothered and imagine something shallow. A person who shrugs at everything. Someone emotionally flat, detached, hard to read, maybe even a little performative in the way they pretend nothing reaches them. It can look stylish from the outside, but it is often a misunderstanding. Because real unbothered strength is not emotional deadness. It is not the absence of feeling, and it is not a personality costume built around acting as if life no longer matters. Real, unbothered strength is inner authority. It is the ability to remain self-governed when life becomes irritating, unfair, messy, or emotionally disruptive. It means something can happen without automatically being allowed to take over your inner condition. It means a setback can be real without becoming your entire state. A person can be rude without being given ownership of your peace. A delay can frustrate you without deciding the tone of your whole day. The outside world still exists. You still register it, but it no longer has unrestricted access to your mind. That distinction restores dignity to the whole idea. Because many people do not want to become cold. They simply want to stop being so internally reachable by everything. They want fewer things to get in and rearrange them. They want to keep caring without being mentally dragged around by every mood, every inconvenience, every careless act, every unnecessary piece of emotional friction. That desire is not immaturity. It is often the beginning of a more serious relationship with self-command. Indifference says, "Nothing matters enough to move me." Inner authority says, "Not everything earns the right to govern me." One posture is empty, the other is selective. One cuts life off in order to stay untouched. The other stays human while becoming less psychologically available to disturbance. That is why being unbothered, in the mature sense, is not about having no reactions. It is about not abandoning your center every time a reaction appears. You can notice irritation without becoming irritable in your whole being. You can feel disappointment without becoming defeated. You can register disrespect without letting it move into your identity. Imagine someone speaking to you with unnecessary sharpness. The indifferent person may appear untouched because they have numbed themselves to human significance. The person with inner authority is different. They notice it. They understand what happened. They may even choose to respond firmly, but they do not let the moment colonize their inner world. Their state still belongs to them. That is what this title is really pointing toward. Not fake detachment, not pretending nothing affects you, but building an inner life with enough structure that other people, setbacks, and circumstances no longer receive automatic emotional access. Once that becomes possible, being unbothered stops sounding shallow. It starts sounding like freedom. Most people imagine strength as the ability to overpower what opposes them, to speak louder, push harder, defend faster, recover quicker, prove more, resist more visibly. But there is another kind of strength that is quieter and, in many ways, harder to build. It is the strength of not cooperating internally with what is trying to pull you down. Not every pressure can be stopped. Not every insult can be prevented. Not every unfair moment can be corrected in real time. But your inner cooperation is still a decision. And that decision changes everything. Life is always offering invitations downward. An invitation into resentment after disappointment. An invitation into insecurity after criticism. An invitation into panic when plans fall apart. An invitation into self-pity when things feel unfair. An invitation into emotional collapse when a day gets heavy. Most people do not notice these as invitations because they arrive disguised as natural reactions. They feel immediate, justified, automatic. But automatic does not mean inevitable. A feeling can arrive without being given full access to the rest of you. That is where being unbothered becomes a real form of strength. Because this kind of steadiness is not passive. It is active non-cooperation. It is the refusal to let life's lower invitations become your inner posture. The setback may be real, but you do not cooperate with turning it into personal defeat. The disrespect may be real, but you do not cooperate with letting it move into your self-worth. The delay may be real, but you do not cooperate with letting it poison the whole day. Something happened, yes, but you do not help it do more damage inside you than it already did outside you. That refusal is powerful. Imagine someone speaks to you with pettiness or contempt. One response is full internal cooperation. You replay it, absorb it, tighten around it, mentally argue with it, carry it into later moments, and let their behavior continue shaping your condition long after the interaction has ended. The other response is different. You still register what happened. You may still set a boundary, respond clearly, or adjust how you deal with that person. But inwardly, you refuse to help the moment grow. You do not water it with extra meaning, extra ego, extra obsession, or extra emotional permission. This is what makes a person hard to pull down. Not invulnerable, not emotional numbness, but disciplined refusal. Refusal to let every irritation become identity. Refusal to let every heavy moment become a heavier self. Refusal to let life's frictions recruit you into moods and meanings that weaken your clarity, your dignity, and your direction. That is not luck. It is not temperament. It is not a gift some people were born with. It is a trained relationship to disturbance. And once you understand that, the whole idea of being unbothered begins to rise in value. It is no longer a shallow pose. It becomes a high-level strength, a way of moving through life without making yourself available to every emotional gravity field that tries to drag you lower than you need to go. You do not have to overpower every difficulty, but you do have to decide whether you will help it set up residence inside you. The hardest person to pull down is not the one who never faces weight. It is the one who stops cooperating with weight becoming identity. Once being unbothered is understood correctly, it stops looking like a mysterious attitude and starts looking like a structure. That matters because many people still treat steadiness as if it were a personality gift. Some people just have thick skin. Some people were born calmer. Some people naturally care less. But that way of thinking is misleading. The people who are hardest to disturb are often not people with less feeling. Many people still treat steadiness as if it were a personality gift. Without making yourself available to every emotional gravity field that tries to drag you lower than you need to go. You do not have to overpower every difficulty, but you do have to decide whether you will help it set up residence inside you. The hardest person to pull down is not the one who never faces weight. It is the one who stops cooperating with weight becoming identity. Once being unbothered is understood correctly, it stops looking like a mysterious attitude and starts looking like a structure. That matters because many people still treat steadiness as if it were a personality gift. Some people just have thick skin. Some people were born calmer. Some people naturally care less. But that way of thinking is misleading. The people who are hardest to disturb are often not people with less feeling. They are people with stronger inner skills. And those skills can be named. The first is pause. A person who is hard to disturb does not instantly hand the moment access to their state. They do not let the first irritation become the first behavior, the first interpretation become the final truth, or the first emotional surge become the whole atmosphere inside them. The pause is what interrupts automatic surrender. It gives the self a chance to arrive before the reaction takes over. Then there is selective attention. Not everything deserves equal focus. The easily disturbed person gives too much attention to what is rude, off, inconvenient, negative, or emotionally noisy. The steadier person filters more carefully. They do not ignore reality, but they do refuse to treat every irritation as worthy of full mental occupation. Attention is one of the great forms of permission. Where it goes, energy follows. Another essential trait is emotional non-fusion. This means feeling something without becoming merged with it. Irritation can arise without becoming identity. Disappointment can land without becoming defeat. Embarrassment can appear without becoming self-condemnation. The person who is hard to disturb still experiences emotion, but they remain separate enough from it to keep self-command intact. They do not become whatever they feel in the moment. Boundary clarity matters too. Many people are not overly bothered because life is uniquely hard. They are overly bothered because too much enters. Other people's moods, pettiness, urgency, insecurity, and disorganization are given too much emotional access. A harder to disturb person knows what belongs to them and what does not. They know that openness without filtering becomes exhaustion. Self-respect is another pillar, and a major one. If you do not respect your own peace, you will keep volunteering it to things that did not earn it. Self-respect changes what you allow yourself to replay, what you permit to define your mood, what kind of treatment you internalize, and how quickly you hand over your center to nonsense. It teaches the mind that not everything gets to sit in the seat of authority. Proportion is equally important. A steady person does not make every moment the size of a crisis. They can tell the difference between what is genuinely serious and what is merely irritating, between what deserves reflection and what deserves release, between what is inconvenient and what is identity-threatening only because ego is enlarging it. Proportion keeps life from becoming heavier than it actually is. And finally, recovery speed. Being hard to disturb does not mean never getting affected. It means you recover more cleanly. You do not stay dragged down longer than necessary. You do not keep feeding the irritation with replay, storytelling, and emotional cooperation. You come back faster because you have trained the path back. Taken together, these traits form the architecture of a person who is hard to disturb. Pause, selective attention, emotional non-fusion, boundary clarity, self-respect, proportion, and recovery speed. This is not mystical toughness. It is a trainable inner structure. And once you see that clearly, being unbothered stops feeling like a vague personality fantasy and starts feeling like something far more serious, practical, and possible to build. One of the most important things to understand about being easily pulled down is that the event itself is often only the beginning. What hurts you first is frequently not what happened, but what your mind decides it means. A delayed reply may be inconvenient, but then the mind adds something heavier. I am being ignored. A criticism may be specific, but the mind turns it into humiliation. A mistake may be ordinary, but the mind converts it into proof that you are failing in some deeper way. That is where the real drag begins, because events do not enter the inner life as pure facts for very long. They pass through interpretation almost immediately. The moment something happens, the mind begins assigning meaning, and meaning is rarely neutral. It leans toward fear, self-protection, ego, memory, and old sensitivities. So what could have remained one difficult moment starts becoming something more personal, more final, and more emotionally expensive than it actually needed to be. This is why two people can live through the same situation and walk away carrying very different emotional weights. One sees the delay as a delay, the other sees it as rejection. One receives corrections as information, the other receives it as exposure. One experiences a bad moment as a bad moment. The other lets it become a statement about identity. The external event may be the same, the internal burden is not. That distinction matters because it reveals the first real enemy. Not life alone, but the meanings that magnify life inside you. Imagine someone speaks with a colder tone than usual. The event itself is simple. The tone changed. But in seconds, the mind may build a much larger reality around it. They are upset with me. I did something wrong. I am being dismissed. This always happens. Now the body tightens, the mood drops, the thoughts speed up, and the whole emotional day begins rearranging itself around a meaning that may not even be fully true. What is hurting you most is no longer the tone. It is the story attached to it. This is why emotional drag begins in interpretation. A setback becomes heavy when it is turned into evidence against you. A slight becomes painful when it becomes personal. An inconvenience becomes draining when it becomes a symbol of how life is going for you. The mind rarely leaves things small. It expands them through what they seem to say. And because this happens so quickly, many people live inside these interpretations without noticing they are interpretations at all. They experience them as reality. That is why the disturbance feels so convincing. It is not merely emotional. It is narrated. The mind has already explained the event in a way that makes the emotional reaction feel justified, inevitable, even rational. But that is exactly where freedom begins. The moment you see that much of what is pulling you down is not only what happened, but what has been built around what happened, your relationship to disturbance starts changing. You begin to realize that life does not always wound you in the first contact. Often, it wounds you in the meaning your mind attaches before wisdom has had a chance to enter. A great deal of what pulls people down is not objectively enormous. It only becomes enormous after the ego gets involved. A look, a tone, a delayed reply, a lack of recognition, a dismissive comment, a small correction, a social slight. None of these things are always trivial, but many of them gain far more emotional weight than they deserve because they strike something image-sensitive inside the self, not the deepest self, the defended self, the self that wants to feel respected, seen, validated, in control, above embarrassment, beyond dismissal. That is why petty things can feel so heavy. They do not arrive merely as events. They arrive as tiny threats to identity. A careless comment is heard not just as carelessness, but as disrespect. Being overlooked becomes evidence of diminished value. A disagreement becomes an attack on competence. A criticism becomes a threat to worth. Once ego begins translating ordinary friction this way, the emotional response becomes larger than the event itself. What should have remained annoying becomes deeply destabilizing. This is not because you are unusually weak. It is because ego is unusually sensitive to what it imagines these moments are saying. Ego wants a position. It wants coherence. It wants to be thought well of. It wants to feel secure in the eyes of others and in its own image of itself. So when life presents even small interruptions to that image, the reaction can be surprisingly intense. The problem is not always the actual importance of the event. The problem is how quickly identity gets entangled with it. When self-image is woven into every interaction, every irritation starts feeling like a referendum on who you are. Imagine someone speaking to you with a slight edge in their voice. The actual moment may not deserve much weight, but if ego is involved, the mind begins inflating it. Why are they talking to me like that? Do they think I am weak? Do they not respect me? Should I correct this immediately? What was a small moment of friction has now become a stage where the self feels it must defend image, status, or value. And once that happens, peace is no longer protecting what matters. It is being traded away to protect pride. This is why some people are so easily dragged by pettiness. They are not only reacting to what happened, they are reacting to what their ego cannot bear to let pass without internal commentary. The smaller the inner security, the more ordinary life feels personally loaded. The more image-conscious the mind, the more every inconvenience starts arriving with hidden insult attached to it. That is an uncomfortable truth, but also a useful one. Because once you see ego as an amplifier, you stop assuming every strong reaction proves something externally important has occurred. Sometimes what has been touched is not your deepest value, but your image of yourself. Not your real dignity, but your need to feel above being ignored, corrected, excluded, or lightly diminished. That distinction matters because it helps you recover proportion. The question becomes sharper. Is this actually serious, or is my ego making it feel serious because it does not like how this moment reflects on me? That question does not humiliate the self. It liberates it. It separates actual importance from ego inflation. And once that separation begins, life loses one of its easiest ways of pulling you down, through the endless trick of making every petty thing feel personal enough to carry. One of the deepest reasons people feel so easily pulled down is that they do not only experience what happens, they merge with it. A bad mood does not remain a bad mood. It becomes the atmosphere of the whole self. A setback does not remain an event. It becomes an identity statement. Someone else's tension does not stay with them. It enters your system and begins shaping your body, your thoughts, your energy, and your sense of the day. This is what fusion does. It removes distance. And once distance disappears, self-command begins disappearing with it. This is the problem beneath many forms of emotional overwhelm. The issue is not always that you feel deeply. The issue is that you become too joined to what you feel. Instead of relating to an experience, you become absorbed into it. Instead of saying, "Irritation is here," the mind says, "I am irritated," and then keeps expanding that state until it colors speech, attention, interpretation, and mood. Instead of saying, "This disappointment hurts," the mind lets disappointment become the lens through which everything else is now seen. That is why passing disturbances can start governing entire stretches of life. The original moment may have been brief, but fusion gives it continuity. It lets the event keep living inside you by turning it into a state rather than a signal. A tense conversation is over, but your nervous system continues carrying it. Someone else's negativity passes through the room, but you keep wearing it afterward. A small failure happens, and now your identity begins bending around it. The moment ended. The fusion did not. This is why some people feel chronically overrun by life, not only because life is difficult, but because too little remains separate inside them. Every emotion enters too deeply. Every atmosphere gets too much access. Every friction point blends too quickly with identity. And once that blending becomes habitual, even ordinary experience begins feeling heavy, personal, and hard to shake. Imagine walking into a room where someone is stressed, irritated, or cold. The event itself is simple. Another person is carrying something. But if you fuse with the atmosphere, their internal state starts becoming yours. Your body tightens. Your mind changes tone. Your peace becomes conditional on their condition. The same thing happens with setbacks. The setback occurs, but then it fuses with self-image. And now you are not only dealing with a problem. You are dealing with who you feel you are because the problem happened. That is the crucial distinction. Feeling something is not the same as becoming governed by it. You can feel hurt without becoming a hurt identity. You can feel frustration without letting frustration decide your tone. You can notice heaviness in an environment without emotionally moving into it. The goal is not numbness. The goal is structure. Enough internal separation that what passes through experience does not immediately become ruler of the self. This is where relief begins. Once you see fusion clearly, you stop calling yourself weak for feeling a lot. You start recognizing that the deeper issue is a lack of inner distance, a lack of space between the event and the identity, the feeling and the self, the atmosphere and your authorship. And that is a trainable problem. Because what you fuse with begins to govern you. But what you can stay in relationship with, without merging into, becomes something you can feel honestly, while still remaining your own. That space is what makes being truly unbothered possible at all. Most things do not pull you down in a single dramatic move. They get in through speed. A tone shifts. A message lands wrong. A delay irritates you. Someone behaves carelessly, and before your wiser mind has even arrived, the moment already has access. Your body tightens. Your mood changes. Your thoughts start building meaning. The event is still small, but inwardly it has already crossed the threshold. This is why the pause matters so much. The pause is the first discipline of being unbothered because it interrupts admission. It stops outer friction from instantly becoming inner possession. It prevents irritation, disrespect, inconvenience, or disappointment from moving straight into your nervous system and setting up authority before you have decided whether it deserves to be there at all. That is a subtle skill, but it changes everything. Most people do not realize how quickly they surrender access. Something happens, and the reaction is immediate. They replay it, tense around it, personalize it, carry it. The moment may last 10 seconds, but internally it has already been welcomed in as a mood, a meaning, a state. The pause breaks that sequence. It says, "Not yet. Let me see this before I let it enter me completely." That is not suppression. It is gatekeeping. Imagine someone speaks with unnecessary sharpness. The old pattern is instant admission. You feel the sting, your mind starts building a case, and your whole inner tone begins changing. The pause does something different. You still notice the sharpness. You do not deny it. But you hold the doorway for a second. You do not immediately let their tone become your state. You allow perception before possession. That is a powerful difference. Because many things only gain emotional power by being admitted too quickly. A small irritation becomes a bad hour because it was given instant psychological resonance. A careless comment becomes a whole mood because there was no pause between hearing it and wearing it. A disappointment becomes discouragement because the mind never stopped to decide whether the event deserved that level of authority. The pause restores that decision. Sometimes it is one breath. Sometimes it is saying nothing for a few seconds. Sometimes it is refusing to answer a message the moment your first reaction flares. Sometimes it is quietly asking yourself, does this deserve entry or only acknowledgement? That question alone can save enormous amounts of peace, because not everything that touches you deserves to enter you. This is where being unbothered stops being a slogan and starts becoming a practice. You no longer assume every external event has the right to become an internal condition. You begin acting like someone with an inner life worth protecting, someone who understands that peace is not only lost through major collapse, but through small, unguarded admissions over and over again. So the first move is not complicated, but it is serious. Pause before you give the moment access to you. Pause before the irritation becomes your mood. Pause before the disrespect becomes your identity. Pause before the inconvenience becomes the emotional quality of your day. That is how inner authority begins, not by controlling life, but by becoming more deliberate about what life is allowed to become inside you. Once you create a pause, the next battle is with meaning, because many things that disturb you do not become heavy only because they happened. They become heavy because the mind begins building around them. A delay becomes neglect. A criticism becomes humiliation. An inconvenience becomes evidence that the whole day is ruined. A setback becomes proof that you are falling behind. The event arrives first, but the suffering often expands through the story built around it. This is why interpretive discipline matters so much. The mind under irritation, disappointment, or insecurity rarely stays with the bare signal. It wants to add implication. It wants to explain, predict, dramatize, and conclude. That is what gives ordinary friction its emotional weight. Not only what happened, but what your mind starts saying it means about your value, your future, your relationships, your competence, or the whole direction of your life. Once that story gains momentum, the original moment becomes much harder to carry lightly. This is the habit that must be interrupted. A useful question is simple. What is the signal, and what is the story? The signal is what actually occurred. They were short with me. The plan changed. I made a mistake. I was not chosen. I have to wait. The story is what the mind builds on top of that signal. They do not respect me. Nothing ever works out. I am failing. I am being left behind. My whole effort is collapsing. The signal may deserve attention. The story is often what creates the emotional drag. Imagine receiving a colder message than expected. The signal is that the tone feels different. That may be real. But within seconds, the mind may build something much larger. They are upset. I did something wrong. This relationship is changing. I am about to lose something important. Now the body reacts not only to a message, but to a forecast. And from there, the whole mood can be hijacked by an interpretation that may be incomplete, exaggerated, or simply false. This is how life gets extra weight. Not because every event is severe, but because the mind keeps enlarging what it touches. It turns irritation into identity, inconvenience into injustice, delay into rejection, correction into collapse. And the more often this happens, the more your inner state becomes dependent on the harshest available interpretation rather than the clearest one. That is a painful way to live, because it means the mind is not only receiving life, it is darkening it. Being unbothered becomes easier the moment you stop cooperating with that enlargement. That does not mean lying to yourself or pretending nothing matters. It means refusing to add more psychological weight than reality actually requires. It means staying close to the event instead of rushing into the most dramatic meaning available. A setback can be a setback without becoming a verdict on your whole life. A slight can be annoying without becoming a wound to your identity. A delay can be inconvenient without becoming emotional proof that you are forgotten or failing. A better inner question is this: what is true here without the extra narrative? That question lightens the mind because it separates contact from exaggeration. It keeps the event in proportion. It protects the self from turning every rough moment into a larger, darker story than it deserves to become. And that is one of the real disciplines of inner stability. You do not merely guard your reactions, you guard the meanings that feed them. Because once the mind stops narrating every irritation as something defining, life loses one of its easiest ways of pulling you down. One of the most important skills in becoming unbothered is learning that not everything deserves emotional entry. Not everything deserves your mood. Not everything deserves your energy. Not everything deserves your mental occupation, your inner commentary, your replay, your private surrender. But most people do not live that way. They live reactively. Whatever is loud, rude, inconvenient, or emotionally sharp gets immediate access. And because of that, their inner life becomes too democratic. Too many things get a vote. This is where standards matter. Standards decide what deserves your state. They ask a different question than emotion asks. Emotion asks, how does this make me feel right now? Standards ask, what is actually worthy of my peace, my seriousness, my attention, my response? That difference is crucial. Without standards, the mind simply follows intensity. With standards, the mind begins selecting rather than absorbing. That is what being unbothered really becomes: disciplined selection. A person without standards-based selection is governed by whatever is most irritating in the moment. A rude tone gets full emotional access. A delay gets half the day. A careless opinion gets to alter self-worth. A petty interaction gets to shape the atmosphere of everything that follows. Nothing is filtered. Everything enters. But a person with standards has a quieter strength. They do not ask only whether something upset them. They ask whether it deserves significance, whether it deserves a response, whether it deserves to occupy internal space beyond the moment in which it occurred. Imagine someone behaving disrespectfully. Emotion may suggest immediate mental cooperation. Carry it, replay it, tighten around it, make it the emotional center of the next few hours. But standards ask something more intelligent. Is this worth my peace? Does this require action or only recognition? Does this deserve a boundary or does it deserve dismissal? What response would protect my dignity without donating my entire state to someone else's behavior? Those questions change the relationship entirely. Because once standards lead, not everything gets promoted to importance simply because it was unpleasant. This is especially important for people who are sensitive, conscientious, or emotionally deep. They often feel everything, notice everything, absorb everything. But feeling something is not the same as granting it authority. A mature inner life still notices what is sharp, unfair, or disappointing. It simply does not hand over power so quickly. It becomes selective, deliberate, principled. It decides what matters by value, not by emotional volume. That is the practical shift. Stop letting irritation decide significance. Some things deserve action. Some deserve a clear boundary. Some deserve thoughtful responses. But many things deserve nothing more than your refusal to internalize them. Not because you are denying reality, but because you are respecting your own state enough not to offer it to everything that asks. That is not emotional avoidance. It is an emotional hierarchy. And hierarchy is what protects peace. Without it, your energy gets spent wherever friction appears. Your attention becomes vulnerable to nonsense. Your direction keeps getting interrupted by whatever is most emotionally noisy. But with standards, your inner life becomes harder to access. Not closed, not cold, just better governed. You stop asking only what bothered me, and begin asking what should have been denied entry altogether. That is one of the clearest marks of someone becoming truly unbothered. They no longer let mood decide what matters. They let standards decide what deserves their state. And once that discipline becomes real, life loses one of its easiest ways of pulling them down. The ability to make everything feel important simply because it was unpleasant. One of the easiest ways to lose yourself is to treat petty people as if they deserve a serious place in your inner life. A dismissive tone, a passive-aggressive comment, a low, needless provocation, a small act of disrespect designed less to communicate anything meaningful than to pull you into reaction. These moments are common, and precisely because they are common, they become one of the greatest daily tests of whether your peace actually belongs to you. Pettiness feeds on cooperation. It needs your attention, your replay, your tightening, your private argument, your emotional labor. It gains force not only from what the other person does, but from what you continue doing with it afterward. You think about it again. You mentally answer it 10 different ways. You imagine what they meant. You let their smallness become your atmosphere. And before long, the pettiness has done more damage inside you than it ever had the power to do on its own. That is why the first rule is simple. Do not volunteer your peace. Not every low-grade provocation deserves emotional entry. Not every rude person deserves psychological residency. Not every petty act is important enough to be carried. Sometimes the most self-respecting thing you can do is to recognize the moment for what it is and refuse to help it grow. Not denial, not weakness. Refusal. Imagine someone speaks to you with that familiar edge meant to invite a reaction. The old pattern is immediate internal cooperation. You feel the sting, your ego rises, your mind starts building a case, and you spend the next hour half living in a conversation that is already over. The stronger posture is different. You still notice the edge. You are not naive. You may even respond if the situation calls for it. But inwardly, you refuse to donate more than the moment deserves. You do not let their pettiness rent space in your head at full price. This is where being unbothered becomes practical. You stop confusing reaction with strength. You stop assuming every disrespect demands emotional participation. Some things require a boundary. Some require distance. Some require directness. But many things require something quieter and harder, not giving the moment the extra fuel of your internal obsession. That distinction protects enormous amounts of energy. Because petty people often want more than a response. They want entry. They want to alter your state, lower your tone, hook your ego, or tempt you into becoming less composed than you really are. And every time you cooperate with that invitation, they are no longer the only ones creating the damage. You are helping the moment continue. A better question is this: does this deserve my peace, or only my recognition? Recognition may be enough. You see what happened. You understand the level of the person. You take note. You protect yourself accordingly. But you do not kneel internally to the moment. You do not carry it longer than necessary, simply because it briefly touched your pride. That is the deeper strength here. Not becoming blind to pettiness, but becoming harder to bait through it. Protecting your state without needing to prove anything. Remaining clear enough to choose whether the moment deserves response, consequence, or nothing at all. Because when people are petty, the real victory is not always saying more. Often, it is refusing to let their smallness become your inner condition. It is one thing to stay unbothered by pettiness. It is another thing entirely to stay steady when life becomes genuinely heavy. Because some moments are not minor, some setbacks are real, some disappointments are deep, some seasons carry bad timing, unfairness, exhaustion, and the kind of emotional weight that cannot honestly be dismissed as small. In those moments, being unbothered must be understood more maturely, or it becomes a shallow idea that breaks the first time life becomes serious. Being unbothered under heaviness does not mean pretending nothing matters. It means refusing to let what matters become the total definition of you. It means feeling the weight without letting the weight become your identity. It means allowing disappointment to be disappointment without turning it into internal defeat. This is one of the hardest distinctions in emotional life. Many people know how to carry heavy moments externally while collapsing inwardly. They keep functioning, but inside they begin making quieter and more dangerous agreements. Maybe this is pointless. Maybe I am behind. Maybe life is against me. Maybe I should stop expecting much. That is how heaviness becomes defeat. Not always through dramatic breakdown, but through the slow surrender of inner posture. A setback happens, then the mind begins lowering itself around it. Energy shrinks. Hope becomes cautious in the wrong way. Standards get weaker. Self-respect becomes harder to feel. The difficult event is no longer only a circumstance. It has started rewriting the emotional shape of the self. This is what must be refused. Not the reality of pain. Not the truth that some seasons are genuinely hard, but the idea that difficulty has earned the right to become your whole identity. You can be discouraged without becoming a discouraged person, in the deeper sense. You can feel grief without becoming psychologically defeated. You can admit that this hurts, this is unfair, this is heavier than I wanted, without letting those truths turn into an internal posture of collapse. Imagine a delayed opportunity, a personal disappointment, a plan that breaks late, a season where effort does not seem to return what it should. The old pattern is not only pain, it is personalization. It becomes a verdict. I am stuck. I am falling behind. This is what my life is. Now the event is no longer being carried out. It is being worn. And once that happens, the heaviness begins spreading into everything else. A steadier posture sounds different. This is heavy, but it is not the whole story. This is painful, but it is not permission to turn against myself. This is disappointing, but it does not get to decide my identity, my standards, or the way I carry my mind through the rest of this season. That is not fake positivity. It is a grounded refusal. And grounded refusal is the real form of being unbothered that hardship requires. Not numbness, not denial, not smiling through what should be felt, but staying rooted enough that life's weight does not become inner surrender. You still feel the burden. You still acknowledge the loss, the frustration, the unfairness, but you do not kneel psychologically to it. That is the strength here, not avoiding heaviness, but preventing heaviness from becoming defeat. Because life will become difficult, plans will fail, timing will disappoint. Some things will hurt more than they should. But if you can remain grounded inside those moments, still carrying yourself, still protecting your center, still refusing to let hardship rewrite the inner self, then even heavy seasons lose some of their power to pull you all the way down. Some things do not pull you down in one obvious moment. They wear you down slowly. A tense workplace, a home filled with friction, a social environment shaped by negativity, gossip, criticism, or constant emotional unpredictability. A season of overstimulation where the mind never fully lands. These environments rarely wound through one dramatic event. They drain through repetition, through the atmosphere, through low-grade contact that seems small in each individual instance, but accumulates until your inner state no longer feels fully your own. This is one of the hardest forms of disturbance to notice clearly. Because when the drag is constant, it starts feeling normal. You stop asking why you feel so depleted, so mentally crowded, so easily irritated, so unlike yourself. You assume you are simply tired, overly sensitive, or bad at coping. But very often the deeper truth is that you are living inside an environment that keeps making withdrawals from your nervous system, your attention, and your emotional steadiness. And because the withdrawal is gradual, you do not always see the damage while it is happening. This is why being unbothered must include environmental intelligence. Not every environment deserves equal psychological openness. Not every room should be entered with your guard completely down. Not every person, pattern, or atmosphere can be absorbed without cost. Some places require stronger internal boundaries, more selective attention, and more deliberate self-protection. Otherwise, repeated drag becomes your baseline. You begin carrying tension that is not entirely yours. You begin mirroring moods that should have stopped at the edge. You begin losing your own tone because the environment keeps imposing its tone on you. This is where porosity becomes dangerous. A porous person does not only respond to what is directly said or done, they absorb the climate, the negativity in the room, the pace, the agitation, the emotional immaturity, the chronic dissatisfaction, the low-level disrespect, and over time, what surrounds them starts shaping what lives inside them. That is how certain environments wear a person down without ever having to attack them in one obvious way. They simply remain themselves long enough for the unprotected mind to slowly adapt downward. So protecting your state becomes a serious discipline. It means entering certain environments with more awareness, not to become paranoid or cold, but to become less absorbent by default. It means noticing when the atmosphere is trying to set your inner pace. It means limiting how much attention you donate to recurring negativity. It means giving less internal entry to people who constantly leak tension, chaos, or disrespect. It means recovering on purpose instead of assuming you can remain exposed indefinitely without consequence. Imagine spending day after day in a setting where urgency is constant, Small irritations are normal. Emotional maturity is scarce, and no one seems to realize how much pressure is being generated just by the atmosphere itself. If you move through that with no filtering, your body and mind will eventually start carrying the environment as if it belongs to you. But if you stay conscious, something different becomes possible. You keep returning to your own breath, your own pace, your own focus. You stop letting every mood in the room become a vote on your state. You become selective about what enters, what stays outside, and what requires distance. That is what it means to protect your state. Not to escape life completely, but to stop offering unlimited psychological access to environments that repeatedly drain you. Because being unbothered is not only about handling one-off moments well, it is also about refusing slow erosion. Refusing to let repeated tension, negativity, and overstimulation quietly rewrite your inner life until exhaustion feels like your personality. At the deepest level, being unbothered is not a performance. It is a relationship. Not first a relationship with other people, difficult situations, or the outside world, but a relationship with your own center, with your standards, with your emotional life, with the part of you that is supposed to remain available when irritation rises, when disappointment lands, when pressure enters, and when life starts trying to rearrange you from the outside in. Many people live in quiet abandonment of that center without realizing it. The moment something sharp happens, they leave themselves. A rude tone appears, and they are gone into reaction. A setback lands, and they are gone into discouragement. Someone else's mood shifts, and they are gone into emotional absorption. Their inner life stops belonging to them so quickly that they begin assuming this is normal. But what they are really experiencing is not only disturbance, it is disconnection from their own center in the moment they need it most. This is why true steadiness is not about having no reactions. It is about remaining in relationship with yourself while reactions rise. That distinction changes everything, because if your standard for being unbothered is never feeling irritation, disappointment, or emotional movement, you will keep failing your own definition. Life will always touch you. The world is too human, too unpredictable, too imperfect for anything else. But if being unbothered means not abandoning your center when life touches you, then a deeper form of steadiness becomes possible. You can feel the reaction and still remain connected to the part of you that knows how to guide it. That is what inner centering really means. It means that when your mind starts building a bigger story, something in you is still there to question it. When your ego flares, something in you is still there to refuse unnecessary cooperation. When heaviness enters, something in you is still there to say, "This is real, but it does not own me." Your center becomes the place you return to rather than the place you lose first. Over time, this creates a kind of inner safety that many people have rarely felt. Not the safety of a perfect life, but the safety of knowing that even when life becomes irritating, unfair, or emotionally noisy, you do not have to disappear into it. You can remain with yourself. You can feel without fusing. You can notice without surrendering. You can carry reaction without handing it the keys. Imagine a difficult day. Old patterns would have turned every friction point into emotional drift. But now, there is more of a relationship with the center. You notice the sting of something, but you do not instantly become it. You feel the downward pull, but you do not fully go with it. You remember your standards sooner. You come back to your own mind faster. That is not a minor improvement. That is identity beginning to change. Because in the end, being unbothered is not really about becoming impossible to affect. It is about becoming harder to remove from yourself, harder to dislodge from your own standards, your own direction, your own inner seat of authority. And once that relationship strengthens, life may still touch you, but it touches a self that is no longer so easy to pull away from its own center. There is a kind of power that does not need to announce itself. It does not rely on sharp reactions, visible force, or emotional volume to prove that it exists. It does not need every room to feel its mood. It does not need every conflict to confirm its importance. It is quieter than that, and because it is quieter, many people miss how strong it really is. This is the power carried by a person who is hard to pull down. Such a person is not untouched by life. They still notice disrespect. They still feel disappointment. They still experience tension, irritation, and emotional movement. But the difference is in what happens next. Their inner life does not become instantly available to every disruption. Their mood is not so easy to recruit. Their dignity is not so cheap to access. And because of that, their presence carries a kind of authority that louder people often lack. Many people still confuse visible reactivity with strength. They assume the strongest person is the one who responds fastest, corrects hardest, flares quickest, or refuses to appear affected by pushing energy outward. But loudness is not always authority. Sometimes it is only poor containment with confidence behind it. Sometimes it is the nervous system speaking before wisdom has entered the room. Sometimes it is ego trying to recover control through display. Quiet power is different. Quiet power stays measured when life is trying to provoke measurement out of you. It stays grounded when the atmosphere is asking you to mirror its chaos. It is hard to bait because it does not need to answer every invitation. It is hard to insult because it does not build identity around every passing opinion. It is hard to drag because it has learned how to remain inwardly led even when the moment becomes emotionally noisy. That kind of steadiness changes how a person moves through the world. They do not waste themselves proving they are not weak. They do not donate reaction just to feel real. They do not hand over their tone, their attention, or their whole internal posture simply because another person brought tension into the room. Their energy remains more intact. Their choices remain cleaner. Their presence becomes less dramatic, but more substantial. Imagine two people facing the same disrespect. One reacts immediately. Their voice changes, their pride rises, and the whole moment becomes charged with the need to answer. The other notices the disrespect just as clearly, but something in them remains under command. They may still respond. They may still set a boundary. But the response is not driven by the need to emotionally prove themselves. It is guided by something steadier. The second person may look less forceful to those who only admire heat, but in reality, they are carrying more power. This is the identity shift that matters. You stop admiring reactivity simply because it is visible. You stop mistaking emotional speed for emotional strength. And you begin valuing a different kind of presence. One that is calm without being passive, firm without being theatrical, responsive without being easily moved off center. That is what quiet power is. It is the authority of a person whose inner world is not so easily entered, redirected, or shaken. A person who remains human, but less available to nonsense. A person whose steadiness does not come from numbness, but from self-possession. And when that kind of power becomes real, you do not merely seem stronger. You become harder for life to reduce. In the end, being unbothered is not built through one perfect day. It is built through refusal. Quiet refusal. Repeated refusal. The refusal to let one rude moment decide the emotional quality of the next 3 hours. The refusal to let a setback become a personal verdict. The refusal to let another person's insecurity become your private atmosphere. These refusals may look small while they are happening, but they are not small. They are the place where a stronger mind is being formed. This is why being unbothered is not a mood you wait for. It is a structure you build. Every pause matters. Every time you interrupt the first reaction before it becomes your whole state, you are changing something. Every cleaner interpretation matters. Every time you stop the mind from building a darker story than reality requires, you are protecting your own inner life from unnecessary weight. Every preserved boundary matters. Every time you keep something from entering too deeply, you are teaching yourself that your peace is not public property. Every calmer response matters. Every time you answer from standards instead of surge, you are becoming someone whose life has a harder time pulling downward. That is the deeper promise hidden inside daily moments. You are not only surviving them, you are training through them. A small irritation that does not get full access. A disappointment that does not become defeat. A petty interaction that does not become an obsession. A heavy day that does not become a heavy identity. These are not random wins. They are acts of inner authorship. They are evidence that the self is becoming less available to disturbance and more loyal to its own center. This is also why progress must be measured differently. Many people still ask the wrong question. They ask, "Did I feel bothered?" But that is not the deepest measure. The better question is, what did I allow that feeling to become? Did it become my whole tone, my whole day, my whole story about myself? Or did I meet it, feel it, and keep my authorship intact? That is the real measure of growth. Not whether life touched you, but whether life got to take too much of you with it. Over time, these small refusals begin to accumulate. The mind learns. The nervous system learns. Identity learns. It learns that discomfort does not have to become collapsed. That irritation does not have to become possession. That heaviness does not have to become defeat. It learns that you are no longer willing to hand your state away so casually. And once the mind starts learning that pattern, something changes at the level that matters most. You begin trusting yourself more. You begin returning to the center faster. You begin feeling less like someone's life can drag around and more like someone who can remain standing inside it. That is the real freedom here. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom from unnecessary internal surrender. Not a life where nothing touches you, but a life where fewer things get to own you after they do. And that freedom is not granted all at once. It is built, quietly, repeatedly, through ordinary moments in which you decide, again and again, that this does not get all of me. So remember this. Every time you refuse the pull, you build a stronger mind. Every pause, every cleaner meaning, every protected boundary, every moment you stay with yourself instead of going down with the disturbance. These are not minor acts. They are how a person becomes harder to lower, harder to bait, harder to drain, and easier to trust from within. And if you keep making those quiet refusals, the life around you may still remain imperfect, but the life inside you will no longer be so easy to pull down.